So sometimes calendars collide. It's the first Sunday of Lent, and that's the main reason why we're celebrating communion this morning. It seems an appropriate celebration as we move into this season. And it's also the Sunday of our annual general meeting, and so that's right after church, and I know you all want to stay for that because you've been looking forward to it all year. You've been looking forward to it all year. Thank you. Whew. Tough crowd. And it's also a joy to welcome new members, and that seems appropriate on the day that we celebrate our meeting, and it reminds us lots of things. So the best way to make all of that happen is to keep the sermon less than 45 minutes. I'll try my best. Kidding. We'll see if we can even do less than that. It's funny that the thoughts come to you in different ways, even at the last minute. I couldn't help thinking as we thought of the passing of your mother, and thus, as Burl mentioned, the ending of that generation that had the amazing vision to start the Naramata Center, which has been a learning center for thousands, literally thousands of people over the years have gone to the Naramata Center and had their lives transformed. They've learned, taken classes and learned, they've taught, they've struggled. It's been a place that has hosted numerous groups that don't necessarily have anything to do with the church, but have loved the setting there and have held meetings there. It's been such an important part of the ministry of the United Church in Western Canada for a generation. And so as I thought of that, and I thought, a couple of years ago, things were not looking good for the Naramata Center, and we thought that it was going to close, and in fact, it had no programming for a year. And just yesterday, I got an email saying, as part of the ongoing revitalization of Naramata Center, we want to have a meeting at the Kelowna church in a few weeks to share with the wider community some of the things that are happening that are enabling Naramata to keep going and to continue on. And there are programs there this summer, and there are plans to reopen some of the buildings that haven't been used. And I thought, God finds ways to make the future always come and always happen, even when, life is a roller coaster. And yet God says, if I've got plans, we're going to make them work. What a great thought for us to hold in mind as we go into our annual general meeting later and make plans for the future. Usually, at that meeting we make plans pretty much for the next year, but it's all part of how can we be God's people in this place tomorrow and the next day and 10 years from now and 100 years from now, because that's important. It's also an interesting thought as we move into Lent. And I was noting that each year in the lectionary, they give, a rich selection of readings for Lent. There's lots of stuff in there. And you can find all sorts of themes that tend to run through. And I couldn't help noticing that in the scriptures this year, there's a lot of emphasis on ways in which God is present for us. And how important that is to pause and notice. Because sometimes it might feel like God is not always there. And yet if we think about it, usually that's because God may not be there the way we had hoped or anticipated or were expecting or thought God ought to be, because that would have worked out really well for us. Sometimes God is there in different ways. But God is always there. And that's one of the wonderful pieces that comes through this reading from Genesis this morning. Now, it comes from the story of Noah, right? Noah and the big flood. And the story of Noah and the flood is it's a fun story. Children love that story because it's got lots of animals. And it's got a rainbow, and the rainbow has taken on so many wonderful, powerful images over the years. Many in the LGBTQ community see the rainbow and know that often it means this is a place where you're safe and you're welcome. It's why we have it at our doors. Many in a variety of communities that are extra aware of diversity, such as communities of people of different ethnicities, of different cultural backgrounds, or groups of people of differing abilities, also see a rainbow and see, that's God's reminder to us that there's room for all of us, even when we're different. Because the rainbow is something, I don't think there's a human being ever that does not feel a response to a rainbow. Especially here in British Columbia, we get them after sometimes days, weeks, months of rain. And even in the midst of that, when you know it's going to keep raining for another, 6-8 months or so it's going to seem, a rainbow will come just for a moment. And it's that reminder that, yes, somehow there will be sunshine again. I promise. There will be an end to snow. There will be an end to rain. And the rainbow comes about in an interesting way in this story. Now, without going into lots of details, but just a quick refresher, I've probably mentioned this before, but the first 5 books of the Bible were written by several different authors, right? They were all oral stories shared around campfires for centuries before anyone wrote them down. Just imagine, think of stories that have been told perhaps around the kitchen table in your home over the generations, or stories that you've heard around a campfire. Think of a good fishing story, because all fishing stories are good. Think of the version written down by great-grandpa, as opposed to perhaps the version written down by great-grandma, or the version written down by the person who caught the biggest fish, or the version written down by the person who caught a lesser fish. Notice in fishing stories, too, each time they're told how the fish changes size, depending on who's telling the story about whom. Now we chuckle, but does that mean that the fishing trip never happened? No. It just means different people are emphasizing different aspects of it. The kernel of the story is still very, very real. A few centuries ago, scholars were looking at stories in the Bible and noticing that especially in those first few books of the Hebrew Scriptures, there seemed to be different storylines. And one of the big clues comes in the story of Noah and the flood, because it tells us that Noah takes 2 animals, 2 of each kind of animal, right, into the ark, a male and a female. And then it says Noah took 7 pairs of animals, 7 males and 7 females, because Noah took 1 pair of animals. And you look at that, and many of us would look at that and say, boy, that editor was sound asleep on the job, because the story didn't match. Now, some people have tried really hard to squeeze them to make it feel like it's all one story, and others said, no, I think it's just because different people wrote it down. And so they started following patterns, and they started extracting streams. And one of the things that happened is we discovered that there's a long stream of story in Genesis and Exodus and the other books, written by someone that gets the interesting name of J, just because it's a German abbreviation. Don't worry about it. But that's their name. And they present us with an interesting image of God, because while some of the other images of God are very different and they're all good, this person wanted to emphasize that God is very, very present. God is very, very personable. This is the God you may recall in the creation stories, which are also different. One of the creation stories has a God that chats with the people, right? God chats with Adam and Eve and asks them questions and wonders with them. It's the God that actually gets God's hands dirty in the mud, which is a pretty amazing image of God's presence in our world to make a creature out of dirt. In this story, this is the God that, amongst other things, gets forgetful. Not an image probably that we attach to God often, but it's right there in this story. God says to Noah at the end of the flood, and when they're finally getting out of the ark, which is good because that thing has got to be pretty smelly by now, they're being released from it, and God says, I'm not going to do this again. This whole destroying you all thing, I thought it was a good idea. But I'm having second thoughts. So tell you what, because there will probably be times, God doesn't say this, but it's certainly right there under the sentences. God basically says, there are going to be other times when I will want to destroy you. Trust me. I know what you're like. We've only been around for a few hundred years at that point, but God knows there will be times that God would like to throttle every one of us all at once. And God says, I'm not going to do that. And if I get tempted to destroy you, I'm going to give myself a sign so that I stop and I don't do it. That's an amazingly powerful piece in that story. God says, I will be tempted to destroy you, but I won't do it. Just for the record, too, I think it means God's not going to destroy us, period. I had someone who really liked the idea that God might destroy us all someday get excited and say, this story only says God won't destroy us with water, but that fire and pestilence are still options. And while that interpretation is legitimate, I tend to think it's God saying, I'm not going to do that. Because I don't think destroying you is the direction we want to go in. And God says, so I'm going to hang up a reminder to me. And what does God hang up? God hangs up a bow. A bow. Not the kind of bow that we tie up a present with. The kind of bow that's shaped like this. And you use that kind of bow when you're going to fire an arrow. This is God saying, I'm going to hang my weapon up because I'm not going to focus on killing. I'm not about destruction. So it would be enough just to take that from that story. It would be a wonderful, wonderful story just to take that piece and just to go about our daily lives going, whoa, God's not out to destroy me, so I can stop worrying about that. I think it becomes just a little stronger as well when we think, okay, if that's true, if God's not going to destroy us, and if God is going to hang up the weapon that God might have used, maybe I should do the same. Maybe our response to God's promise, maybe our response to a rainbow is to think of what God has done for us, to say, I won't destroy you. And for us to think long and hard about the things we do, the weapons we fire, and I'm not necessarily talking here about AK-47s. I'm talking about the weapons we use like words that you can't take back, actions that leave other people feeling pretty much shot down. We're all very good at that, and I say we, I don't point fingers. I know that I'm very good at that sometimes. But I read this story and I see a rainbow and I am reminded of what God has done, and maybe I need to recommit myself. Maybe we need to recommit ourselves to saying, God, if you would do that for us, let's see if we can do that for one another. Amen.